The silence in Observation Chamber 7 was a manufactured thing, a sterile vacuum pressed between sheets of reinforced cryglass. It was a silence designed to amplify, to turn the soft scuff of a slipper on the sanitized floor into a declaration of failure. Enforcer Prime Kalen stood within that silence, a pillar of black and silver against the oppressive, uniform white of the Directorate's architecture. His gloved hands were clasped behind his back, his posture a rigid line of ideological purity. Beyond the glass, the subject, Omega 734, paced the confines of its sterile pen, a 10 by 10 cube of absolute control. The air Kalen breathed was recycled, scrubbed of all organic contaminants, smelling only of cold metal and ozone from the filtration units. It was the scent of order, the scent of his world. He watched the Omega, his gaze clinical, detached. The creature was small, its frame delicate beneath the standard issue grey tunic. Its movements were agitated, bird-like, a frantic dance of despair contained. A faint, cloying scent, a mix of distressed pheromones and unrefined sugar, bled through the glass's microfilters, a biological stain on the chamber's purity. Kalen's lip curled in a flicker of distaste so minute it was imperceptible to any but himself. Weakness. It was the defining characteristic, the genetic flaw that necessitated the Directorate's firm, paternal hand. They were unstable, ruled by scent and cycle, their very biology a threat to the logical, ordered society the Alphas had painstakingly built from the ashes of the old world's emotional chaos. They were not partners, they were problems, biological liabilities to be managed, contained, and, when necessary, purged. Kalen's datapad chimed, a soft, deferential tone. He glanced down. The Omega's vitals were spiking, heart rate elevated, cortisol levels critical. It was nearing its breaking point, the inevitable collapse of its fragile emotional architecture. He made a note on the file. Subject 734 exhibiting predictable degradation. Recommend for final processing within 12 hours. He felt nothing. No pity, no satisfaction. It was simply data, a logical conclusion to a flawed equation. He was not a monster. He was a scientist of the social order, a surgeon excising a sickness. This was the litany he had perfected over a decade of service, the cold mantra that had insulated him from the messy, organic reality of his work. The memory of another Omega, another scent of wilting flowers and bitter medicine, tried to surface, a ghost at the edge of his consciousness. He pushed it down with brutal efficiency. Emotion was a variable, and variables were to be eliminated. He turned from the glass, the frantic pacing of the doomed creature behind him, nothing more than the background noise. The observation chamber was his sanctuary, a place of clean lines and colder truths. The long, polished console before him reflected his face, a mask of controlled severity. High cheekbones, a jawline sharp as broken glass, and eyes the color of a winter sky. They were his father's eyes, the eyes of a man who had understood the necessity of sacrifice for the sake of order, a man who had stood by, face like stone, as the system corrected a flaw within his own home. Kalen's hatred for Omegas was not a simple prejudice. It was a memorial. It was the foundation upon which he had built his entire existence, a fortress of logic and duty against the encroaching chaos of sentiment. Another chime, this one sharper, demanding his attention. A priority directive flashed across the main screen of the console, the crimson seal of the Directorate's highest authority pulsing like a severed artery. He straightened, his focus absolute. Such directives were rare, reserved for threats that endangered the core stability of the sectors. He placed his palm on the scanner. The console hummed, verifying his biometric signature, his genetic purity, his unwavering loyalty index. The file unlocked. The text was stark, clinical, a cascade of black letters on a white field. Asset designation, subject 0. Biological classification, Omega, anomalous. Status, at large. Evasion. Duration, 7 years, 4 months. Threat level, critical. Symbolic, catalyst for dissident sentiment. Below the text was a string of corrupted data, failed tracking logs, and a single, distorted image. It was less a photograph and more an impressionistic smear of movement. A figure caught between surveillance frames, a ghost in the machine. The face was obscured, a blur of pale skin and dark hair. There was no clear identifying feature, only a sense of fluid motion, of something that refused to be pinned down, to be categorized. For 7 years, this anomaly had evaded the most sophisticated tracking network ever devised. A ghost. A rumor whispered in the decaying lower sectors, a symbol of defiance for the malcontents and the genetically impure. And then, a name. Known alias Elias. The name meant nothing to him. It was just a sound. But the file, the years of failure attached to it, the sheer impossibility of this Omega's continued freedom. It was an insult to the very concept of order. It was a stain that had been allowed to spread for far too long. He read the final line of the directive, his eyes narrowing. Objective. Neutralize. By any means necessary. This is a prime directive. Enforcer Prime Kalen. Bring this to an end. He closed the file. The reflection of his face on the dark screen seemed harder, colder. The creature in the pen behind him had begun to weep, the sound a thin, pathetic thread in the manufactured silence. It was the sound of everything he despised, the sound of the weakness that had taken his mother. He was not just an enforcer. He was an avenger, a guardian of a pristine world bought with a terrible, necessary price. He would not fail. He would hunt this ghost. He would find this Elias. He would not just contain him. He would not just process him. He would erase him. He would scatter his component atoms to the sterile winds, leaving not even a memory. He swore it on the cold, hard logic that was his only god. The hunt was on, and it would be the last. The comms unit on Kalen's console shimmered to life, the placid, synthesized face of Director Valerius coalescing from the light. Valerius's features were perpetually serene, his silver hair combed back from a high, unlined forehead. He was the architect of the Directorate's internal security, a man who wielded absolute power with the dispassionate grace of a conductor guiding an orchestra. His calm was more unnerving than any alpha's roar. It was the calm of a predator that knows its prey has no escape. Enforcer Prime Kalen, Valerius began, his voice a smooth, modulated baritone that slid through the air like chilled mercury. You have received the directive concerning Subject 0. It was not a question. I have, Director, Kalen replied, his tone as flat and polished as the floor beneath his feet. The objective is clear. Is it? Valerius's lips curved in a smile that did not reach his pale, observant eyes. The objective is neutralization, Kalen, but the purpose is symbolic. This, Elias, has become a folk tale, a whisper of hope in the dark corners where our light has not yet fully penetrated. Hope is a disease, Enforcer Prime. It encourages the weak to believe they have strength. It must be excised with theatrical precision. Kalen remained silent, his gaze fixed on the director's holographic face. He understood the theater of power, a public capture, a televised confession, a sterile and efficient purging. It would reaffirm the directorate's omniscience. "This is more than just another assignment for you, isn't it?" Valerius continued, his voice softening with feigned empathy. The director was a master of emotional manipulation, able to find the hairline fractures in any subordinate's armor. The subject's file contains interesting anomalies, pheromonal signatures that bear a passing resemblance to archaic profiles from the Phoenix Project. Kalen's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. The Phoenix Project, the official name for the series of disastrous genetic experiments from 2 decades ago, a failed attempt to stabilize the Omega genome, a project his own father had overseen, a project that had ended with the necessary purging of all its subjects, his mother included. It was a sealed part of history, a wound cauterized and covered over by official decree. "The data is likely corrupted," Kalen stated, his voice a low, cold hum. "Cross-contamination from archived files." "Perhaps," Valerius conceded, though his eyes suggested he believed otherwise. Regardless, capturing the last ghost of that failed era, it would provide a certain closure. For the directorate, of course, and perhaps for you as well. A final, definitive statement on the inherent instability of that particular genetic path. The subtext was clear, a silken threat wrapped in a comforting promise. Succeed, and you will finally put the ghost of your past to rest. Fail, and you will prove that her weakness runs in your veins. "My personal history is irrelevant," Kalen said, the words clipped. "I serve the directorate. The subject will be neutralized. Its symbolism will be dismantled." Valerius's smile widened, a brief flash of white. "Excellent, Kalen. I have absolute faith in your efficiency. You are, after all, our finest instrument. So perfectly calibrated. Do not disappoint." The transmission ended, leaving Kalen alone once more in the humming silence. An instrument. Perfectly calibrated. That is what he was. His father had forged him, the directorate had honed him, and his mother's memory had given him his edge. He was a weapon, aimed at the heart of chaos. He turned and strode from the observation chamber, his long black coat settling around him like folded wings. The sounds of Omega 734's quiet sobbing faded behind him. Irrelevant. He passed through corridors of gleaming white, the rhythmic echo of his boots, the only sound. Guards in polished armor snapped to attention, their featureless helmets reflecting his own impassive face 100 times over. He was a symbol himself, the embodiment of alpha control, of unwavering purpose. He did not feel the weight of their gazes. He felt nothing but the cold fire of his mission. He stepped out of the sterile confines of the central nexus and into the cityscape. Here, order was manifest. Maglev vehicles slid silently along designated pathways. Buildings of glass and steel pierced the artificially blue sky of the atmospheric dome. The air, scrubbed and ionized, carried no stray scents, no hint of the organic world that festered beyond the city's perimeter walls. It was a perfect, harmonious machine, and Elias was a wrench in its gears. Kalen's personal transport, a sleek black vehicle devoid of any markings, awaited him. He slid into the driver's seat, the cockpit molding around him. He brought up the file for Subject 0 again, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. He bypassed the corrupted location data, the failed tracking attempts. That was the work of lesser minds. They had been hunting a physical entity. Kalen knew you did not hunt a ghost by chasing its shadow. You hunted it by understanding what made it a ghost in the first place. He cross-referenced the file with city schematics, focusing on the blind spots, the old service tunnels, the abandoned industrial sectors, the places where the Directorate's pervasive surveillance network was thinnest, places of decay, places where the past was allowed to rot. He plotted a probable trajectory, a web of possibilities based on resource availability and evasion patterns. The ghost had to eat, it had to sleep, it had to leave a trace, no matter how faint. He focused on a report from 3 days prior, a minor energy fluctuation in the derelict sector Gamma 9, dismissed as a fault in the decaying power grid. But the fluctuation had a strange signature, a biofeedback loop inconsistent with mechanical failure. It was small, almost undetectable, but it was something. It was a start. He engaged the transport's drive, the vehicle lifting silently from the platform and merging with the stream of traffic. He was moving away from the pristine heart of the city toward the decaying edges, the forgotten places where the wild things lived. He felt the familiar surge, the sharpening of the senses, the cold thrill of the hunt. This time was different. This was not a job. It was a reckoning. He had sworn to destroy this Omega, this last lingering echo of a past he had tried so desperately to bury. He would not just erase a symbol of dissent, he would salt the earth of his own memory. Sector Gamma 9 was a skeleton picked clean by progress. The buildings were rust-stained husks, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the perpetually grey, smog-choked sky that existed just beyond the city's atmospheric shield. Here, the air wasn't scrubbed clean. It tasted of damp concrete, of decay, of the slow, inexorable return to dust. Kalen's transport settled silently in a plaza, choked with weeds and debris. He stepped out, his polished boots crunching on shattered pavement. The contrast was stark, his own immaculate form against the backdrop of urban ruin. He was an antibody entering a festering wound. He moved through the silent streets, a shadow in the gloom. His senses, usually dulled by the sterile city air, were on high alert. He could smell the metallic tang of rainwater pooling in rusted-out machinery, the musty sweetness of mold creeping up damp walls. These were the scents of failure, of systems left to rot. He found the source of the energy fluctuation, an old power substation, its transformer humming with a weak, illicitly drawn current. The access panel had been bypassed with crude but effective wiring, amateurish yet clever. Inside, the darkness was thick, broken only by the faint green glow of Kalen's tactical visor. He followed a trail of faint footprints in the dust, leading deeper into the labyrinthine facility. They led him to a small maintenance locker, the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open. It was not a squalid den. It was a space that had been reclaimed, made human. A worn blanket was folded neatly in one corner. An old, dog-eared book of pre-Directorate poetry lay open on a makeshift table, its pages filled with underlined verses about the sea and the stars, concepts alien to most city dwellers. On the grimy wall, someone had sketched charcoal drawings of birds in flight, their wings impossibly wide, straining for a freedom that did not exist. In a crack in the concrete floor, a single pale green sprout pushed its way toward a sliver of light from a ventilation shaft nurtured in a small mound of scavenged soil. It was a pocket of desperate, defiant life in the heart of death. And then he smelled it. It was faint, almost lost beneath the dominant odors of rust and damp. But it was there. It cut through the decay like a sliver of glass. Kalen froze, his entire being focused on that single sensory input. It was not the cloying, sickly sweet scent of fear and submission he associated with omegas. He had catalogued hundreds of pheromonal signatures in his career, from the most common to the rarest genetic outliers. None of them were like this. This was clean. It was the scent of ozone after a lightning strike, the smell of rich, dark earth after a soaking rain. There was a hint of something wild and green beneath it, like crushed leaves, and an almost imperceptible trace of something metallic and sharp, like blood or static electricity. It was a scent that spoke not of weakness, but of resilience, of storms and survival. It was unsettling. It was a piece of data that did not fit any known parameter. His training, his entire belief system, was predicated on the biological certainty of Omegan frailty. Their scents were signals of their need, their heat cycles, their distress. This scent signaled none of those things. It was self-contained, complex, and utterly alien. He pulled a small silver device from his belt, a portable atmospheric analyzer. He held it in the center of the small room, its sensors whirring softly. The device was designed to break down and categorize any pheromonal signature, cross-referencing it with the Directorate's vast genetic database. A moment later, a line of text appeared on its small screen. Signature detected. Profile uncatalogued. Classification anomalous. Anomalous. The same word from the file. It was not an error. Kalen stared at the single, struggling plant in the corner, at the charcoal birds on the wall. He thought of the 7 years of evasion. This was not just a fugitive. This was something new, something the system had not predicted. A flicker of something akin to curiosity sparked within him, a dangerous, unfamiliar sensation. He crushed it instantly. It was irrelevant. A new variable did not change the equation. It simply required a new method of solving it. Anomalous or not, it was still an omega. It was still a flaw. He stored the scent signature in the analyzer's memory. He now had a thread to follow. He backed out of the small room, his mind already calculating, processing. The ghost had a scent, and Kalen was the finest hound the Directorate had ever bred. The hunt had truly begun. He would follow this impossible fragrance to its source and extinguish it forever. The memory of the scent, however, lingered in his mind, a discordant note in the cold, clean symphony of his purpose. The scent was his map. Kalen followed the anomalous signature through the city's forgotten veins, a journey into the past. The trail led him away from the decaying industrial sectors and into the silent, waterlogged ruins of the old hydro plant that had once powered the pre-Directorate metropolis. It had been decommissioned for decades, a colossal concrete tomb slowly being reclaimed by moisture and time. The air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of stagnant water and the low, resonant hum of machinery in its death throes. Water dripped from unseen cracks in the ceiling, each drop a percussive beat in the vast, echoing silence. Kalen moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his footfalls making no sound on the grated metal walkways. His tactical visor cut through the oppressive darkness, painting the world in shades of green and thermal orange. The scent was stronger here, a constant, tangible presence in the air. Ozone and wet earth. It clung to the damp walls, pooled in the cold air, a breadcrumb trail leading him onward and upward. He ascended a spiral staircase, the metal groaning under his weight. He was close. The concentration of the pheromones was increasing exponentially. He emerged onto a high catwalk that spanned the cavernous main turbine hall. Far below, massive, silent turbines sat half-submerged in black water. And there, at the far end of the catwalk, was a silhouette. A figure stood against a massive, shattered window, the grey, rain-lashed world outside framing it in stark relief. The ghost. Subject 0. Elias. Kalen raised his pulse rifle, the weapon's targeting laser a single, unwavering red dot in the gloom. He settled it on the center of the figure's back. His movements were economical, precise, the culmination of 1,000 drills, 1,000 captures. The words formed in his mind, the standard, unyielding command. Subject 0, you are contained under Directorate Mandate 7. Cease all movement. Surrender now. But the words did not come. He hesitated. For a single, inexplicable heartbeat, he simply watched. As if sensing his presence, the figure turned, slowly, not with the panicked jerk of the cornered, but with a weary, deliberate grace. For the first time, Kalen saw him clearly. He was thin, his grey tunic soaked through in places, his dark hair plastered to his skin by the damp air. His face was pale, sharp-boned, and smudged with grime, but it was his eyes that held Kalen captive. They were dark, wide, and held none of the terror Kalen had expected. There was no cowering fear, no desperate plea for mercy. There was only a profound, soul-deep exhaustion, and beneath it, a sliver of hard, defiant light. As Elias turned, the scent hit Kalen like a physical blow. It was no longer a faint trail. It was a tidal wave. It was the raw, undiluted essence of the Omega, and it was overwhelming. The ozone was the sharp, clean crackle of a live wire. The wet earth was the smell of a freshly dug grave, of life and death intertwined. And beneath it all, the metallic tang was sharper now, the taste of blood on the tongue, the scent of a wound. But it was more than the sum of its parts. It was a story of running, of hiding, of surviving in the cracks of a world that wanted him erased. It bypassed his training. It slipped past the chemical suppressants that ran in his veins, designed to render him immune to pheromonal influence. It went straight to the oldest, most primitive part of his brain, and it triggered something. A memory, fragmented and buried, flashed behind his eyes. A dark room, a woman's soft humming, and the scent of rain on a window pane. A lullaby he couldn't hear, a face he couldn't see. It was a ghost of a feeling, a warmth that had been excised from him so long ago he had forgotten it ever existed. His carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. The low hum of the hydro plant became a deafening roar in his ears. The red targeting dot on Elias's chest wavered. His vision tunneled, the edges blurring to grey. His finger, resting on the trigger, felt numb. The man before him was not Subject 0. He was not an anomaly. He was familiar. A resonance, a chord struck deep within Kalen's own biology that he had never known was there. Elias watched him, his head tilted slightly, a silent, knowing question in his dark eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stood there, a beacon of impossible scent and quiet defiance, and waited. The moment stretched into an eternity. Kalen's mind was a war zone. Neutralize, screamed his training, his ideology, his entire life's purpose. Destroy the flaw. Erase the symbol. But his body would not obey. His hand trembled, a microscopic tremor that felt like an earthquake. The pulse rifle felt impossibly heavy. He was the instrument of the Directorate, perfectly calibrated. But now, a new sound was playing, a new frequency, and the instrument was breaking. Slowly, With a sense of dreamlike detachment, he lowered the rifle. The red dot vanished from Ilias's chest. The silence rushed back in, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the drip of water in the vast, dark hall. He opened his mouth, but the formal command was gone. A single word came out, his voice a rough, unfamiliar rasp. Contained. It was a lie and a truth all at once. He had not contained the subject, he had contained himself. He had overridden his primary directive. He had broken his vow. In that single word, in that one small act of inexplicable mercy, Kalen, enforcer prime of the Directorate, had committed his first true act of rebellion, and he had no idea why. Kalen did not take him to the central nexus. He did not log the capture. To do so would be to sign Elias's death warrant, to hand him over to Valerius's sterile theater of symbolic execution. Instead, he took him to a place that did not officially exist. A black site, a forgotten relic from the Directorate's early consolidation of power, designated only as Sub-Level 9. It was a single, self-contained containment cell, buried deep beneath the city's foundations, known only to a handful of enforcer primes as a final contingency. It was a place of secrets, a concrete box wiped from every map. It was Kalen's secret. He led Elias through silent, dust-choked corridors, the beam of his flashlight cutting a lonely path through the darkness. Elias followed without a word, his steps light, his presence a quiet, unnerving weight behind Kalen. The cell was as stark as Kalen's own ideology. A concrete slab for a bed, a toilet, a sink. The air was stale, cold. Kalen activated the power. A single, recessed light flickered on, casting long, stark shadows. He gestured for Elias to enter. The Omega did, his gaze sweeping over the small space, analytical, calm. He was not panicking. He was assessing. Kalen sealed the heavy door, the sound of the magnetic locks engaging, echoing in the profound silence. He retreated to the adjoining observation room, a cramped space identical to his pristine chamber in the Nexus, but grimier, forgotten. He watched Elias through a panel of one-way chromaglass. He had provided a bottle of water and a nutrient paste bar, setting them just inside the cell before sealing it. An illogical gesture. An asset did not require such considerations, but he had done it anyway. Elias did not touch the provisions. He simply sat on the edge of the concrete slab, his back straight, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He looked like a fallen monk in meditation, a figure of unnerving stillness in the heart of his own captivity. He was waiting. Hours later, Kalen initiated the first interrogation. He did not enter the cell. He spoke through the comms unit, his voice deliberately flat, devoid of emotion. Identify yourself. State your purpose. Elias looked toward the dark glass, as if he could see Kalen perfectly. His voice, when it came, was quiet but clear, with a strange, melodic timbre. You know my designation. As for my purpose, I suppose it was to survive. What is yours, Enforcer Prime? The question caught Kalen off guard. Interrogations were a one-way flow of information. He was the one who asked the questions. My purpose is to maintain order. Is that what you call this? Elias gestured vaguely at the concrete walls. Order? Or just a smaller cage than the one outside? Kalen's frustration, a cold, sharp thing, began to rise. You are a biological liability, a genetic flaw that promotes instability. Your very existence is an act of chaos. It was a line from the Directorate's core manifesto, a truth he had never questioned. Elias's lips curved in a faint, sad smile. You've been taught your lessons well. But is survival truly a weakness? Or is the desperate need for absolute control the truest form of fear? The words were a scalpel, slicing through layers of Kalen's conditioning. And then, the scent, faintly, through the ventilation of ozone and wet earth. It triggered the memory again, sharper this time. A flash, a young boy, no older than 7, hiding in a closet. Through the crack in the door, he sees his mother, her face pale, her scent faint like wilting lilies, filled with a terror she is trying to hide. 2 enforcers in black armor stand before her. His alpha father stands to the side, his face a mask of stone, his expression unreadable. The subject is unstable, one enforcer says. She must be purged. His mother looks at his father, her eyes pleading. He does not meet her gaze. He simply nods. As they lead her away, a sanitizing unit activates, filling the air with the sharp, chemical scent of ozone. To erase her pheromonal trace, to erase her. Kalen slammed his gloved fist against the observation console. The hardened surface, designed to withstand ballistic impact, starred with a web of hairline fractures. He stared at the cracks, his own reflection splintered and broken within them. The perfect facade was damaged. He was breathing heavily, the cold, stale air of the black site suddenly feeling suffocating. He had told himself for 20 years that his father had made a necessary sacrifice, that his mother's Omega weakness had been a threat. He had built his life on that cold, hard fact. Elias's voice came softly through the comm, pulling him back from the edge of the memory. Control is a fragile thing, Enforcer. It shatters so easily. Kalen looked at the fractured console, then at the calm, watchful figure in the cell. This was not an interrogation. It was a deconstruction. And the thing being deconstructed was him. The days in Sublevel 9 bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of darkness and artificial light. The interrogations continued, but their nature had irrevocably shifted. They were no longer about extracting data. They had become a dangerous, unwilling dialogue. Kalen would recite directorate doctrine, and Elias would counter with quiet, incisive questions that chipped away at the foundations of Kalen's world. They spoke of freedom, of fear, of what it meant to be human in a system that prized mechanization. Kalen found himself breaking protocol in small, increasingly significant ways. He began bringing Elias actual food from the upper levels, a piece of fruit, a portion of bread, instead of the tasteless nutrient paste. He brought him a blanket when the cell grew too cold. He even left a datapad loaded with neutral texts, histories, scientific journals, telling himself it was a strategy to foster compliance. He logged these actions in a falsified report for his own records, a litany of lies. Asset is responding to behavioral incentives, psychological conditioning proceeding as planned. But it was not the asset being conditioned. He spent hours in the observation room watching Elias. The Omega was a creature of quiet routine. He would meditate, he would read, he would pace the small cell with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He rarely slept for long, his rest broken by the ingrained hyper-vigilance of the hunted. It was during one of these restless nights that it happened. Kalen was reviewing the silent security footage, watching the rise and fall of Elias's chest in the dim light, when a wave of emotion crashed over him. It was not his own. It was a feeling of profound, soul-crushing loneliness, the weight of years spent utterly alone, a ghost in a world of solid beings. It was followed by a sharp, metallic spike of fear, the echo of a near capture in some forgotten alleyway. The feelings were so intense, so visceral, that Kalen physically stumbled back from the monitor, his hand flying to his chest. He gasped for air, his own heart hammering in sympathy. It was an empathic bleed-through, a psychic resonance he had only read about in the most classified, speculative texts on anomalous biology. It was impossible. A few days later, Elias's quiet routines ceased. He remained on the concrete slab, curled under the blanket Kalen had provided, shivering despite the regulated temperature. His breathing was shallow. Kalen checked the cell's biomonitors. Elevated temperature, irregular heart rate. The asset was sick. His first instinct was to follow protocol, let the weakness run its course. If the asset expired, the problem was solved. But he couldn't. The thought of Elias dying alone in this concrete box sent a shard of ice through his chest. It was the echo of that loneliness he had felt, now made terrifyingly real. Against every rule, against every fiber of his being that screamed contamination, he overrode the lock and entered the cell. The air inside was thick with Elias's scent, but it had changed. The ozone and earth were still there, but they were soured with the bitter smell of fever. Elias's eyes fluttered open as Kalen approached. They were glassy, unfocused. "Just checking the asset's condition," Kalen said, his voice a low growl, more for his own benefit than for Elias's. He reached out a gloved hand and pressed it to Elias's forehead. The contact was a cataclysm. It was not just the heat of the fever radiating through the thin material of the glove. It was a jolt of pure information, a bioelectric shock that arced from Elias's skin to his. Kalen felt it all, the bone-deep weariness, the gnawing ache of hunger, the sharp stabbing pain behind his eyes, and beneath the physical misery, he felt the core of the Omega's being, a stubborn, unyielding flame of life, a will to survive that was as powerful and inexorable as a tectonic plate. In that same instant, the connection flowed both ways. He felt Elias sense him, not his rank, not his authority, but the raw, unshielded truth of him, the cavern of grief he carried for his mother, the cold rage at his father, the towering brittle walls he had built around his heart, the observer and the observed, the hunter and the hunted. In that single moment of contact, the mirror between them shattered into a million pieces. Kalen snatched his hand back as if burned, his breath catching in his throat. Elias's fevered gaze was suddenly lucid, impossibly clear. He saw Kalen, not the enforcer, the man. Kalen stumbled out of the cell, sealing the door behind him. He leaned against the cold wall, his entire body trembling. He was compromised. He was contaminated. He had to report this. He had to call Valerius and admit his failure. He reached for his comms unit, but his fingers paused. He thought of Valerius's serene, predatory smile. He thought of the sterile operating theaters of the processing centers. He thought of Elias, shivering and alone, yet possessing a strength he had never encountered. He put the comms unit away. He went to the medical locker, a resource he was not authorized to use, and retrieved a fever reducer and a hydration pack. He was no longer containing an asset. He was protecting a life. And in doing so, he was committing treason. Elias recovered slowly. The fever broke, leaving him weak but lucid. The stillness returned, but it was different now. When Kalen watched him through the chromaglass, he often found the Omega looking back, his gaze direct and knowing. The pretense of the interrogation was gone, leaving only a tense, fragile silence between them. It was Elias who finally broke it. "You felt it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice still raspy. He was sitting on the edge of the slab, the blanket draped over his shoulders. "When you touched me, you felt what I am." Kalen stood in the observation room, his hand resting on the fractured console. He did not answer. There were no words in the directorate's lexicon for what he had felt. It was data that could not be quantified, an experience that defied his clinical understanding of the world. Elias seemed to take his silence as an answer. He took a slow breath, a great weariness settling over him. It was the weariness of a man who had carried a secret for too long. I think it's time you understood what you were hunting." He paused, gathering his strength. "There are others. Not many. We live in the places the Directorate has forgotten. We call it the Sanctuary. It's not a place, not really. It's a network, a promise to remember. We keep the old histories, the books, the art, everything the Directorate sought to erase in the name of its perfect, sterile order." Kalen listened, his face an impassive mask. Descent cells were not a new concept. He had dismantled dozens of them. They were always small, pathetic gatherings of the malcontent and the genetically flawed. But then, Elias's voice grew softer, more personal. "We remember the people, too. The ones who were purged, the ones who were used. People like your mother." Kalen froze. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. "You will not speak of her." The words were a low, dangerous warning. "Her name was Lyra," Elias said, his voice gentle but firm, ignoring the threat. "She had a scent, like lilies after a rainstorm. She loved the old stories, the ones about oceans so vast they met the sky. She taught them to her son." A memory, sharp and agonizing, pierced through Kalen's defenses. A woman's hand, smaller than his, tracing constellations on his palm. The scent of lilies. The name was a key, unlocking a room in his mind that had been sealed for 2 decades. The grief was so sudden, so overwhelming, it felt like a physical blow. "How?" Kalen choked out, the single word a betrayal of his composure. "Her records are sealed, purged." "Some things cannot be purged," Elias said softly. "The Sanctuary remembers, and we know the truth of what happened to her. She wasn't purged because she was a defective Omega, Kalen. She was taken because she was too powerful." He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto the unseen point where he knew Kalen stood. "She was the primary subject of the Phoenix Project, your father's project. They weren't trying to stabilize Omegas. They were trying to weaponize them. They were engineering Omegas whose pheromonal influence was so subtle, so powerful, it could bypass an alpha's conditioning. Omegas who could calm a riot or incite one, who could inspire loyalty or terror. They wanted a new form of control, a biological one. Kalen's world began to dissolve. The sterile room, the hard facts, the entire architecture of his life. It was all turning to smoke. "The scent you smelled on me," Elias continued, "the ozone, it wasn't from a sanitizer unit that day. It's a unique biochemical marker, a byproduct of the genetic sequence they forced into her, into us. I am a child of that project, Kalen, born in secret in the Sanctuary from another subject who escaped the purge. I carry Lyra's genetic legacy. It's why you felt that connection. Our biology is designed to resonate." The final, terrible piece of the puzzle slotted into place. The familiarity of the scent, the empathic bleed-through, the jolt of contact. It wasn't a flaw. It was a feature. "Your father. Elias's voice was barely a whisper now, laden with a sorrow that was not just his own. He couldn't control her, her influence, her empathy. It was too strong. It was beginning to affect him, to make him question the directorate's purpose. It made him feel, and he was terrified of it. He was terrified of the very thing he had created. So he declared the project a failure and had all the subjects eliminated. A cover-up. He let you believe it was her weakness that destroyed your family, Kaylin. He let you build your life on that hatred, but it wasn't her weakness. It was his fear. Silence. A profound, ringing silence in which 20 years of lies collapsed into a pile of rubble. Kaylin stared at his own splintered reflection in the console. The man staring back was a stranger, a fool, a weapon forged from a lie, aimed by his own father at the memory of his mother. He was not an enforcer of order. He was the guardian of a murderer's secret. He was not an asset. He was not an instrument. He was a son whose grief had been stolen, twisted, and weaponized against his own kind. The hatred that had been his shield, his sword, his entire world, was gone. And in its place there was only a vast, cold, empty space, and the quiet voice of an Omega in a box, telling him the devastating truth. The truth had barely settled, a layer of radioactive dust on the ruins of Kaylin's world, when the world itself began to scream. A high-pitched alarm, shrill and invasive, blared through the black site's hidden speakers. Red emergency lights pulsed to life, strobing rhythmically, plunging the corridor and the cell into a hellish, rhythmic cycle of blood red and absolute black. The system had been breached. He had been found. Valerius's voice, stripped of its usual silken calm, crackled over the intercom. It was cold, sharp, and filled with a profound, clinical disappointment. Enforcer Prime Kaylin, your failure to report is a violation of Prime Directive 1. Your sentimentality has compromised a critical directorate asset. You have been deemed unstable. Stand down and await reprocessing. Heavy rhythmic footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Enforcers, an entire squad. They were coming for Elias and for him. In the strobing red light, Kaylin looked at the monitor. Elias was on his feet, his back pressed against the far wall of the cell, but his expression was not one of fear. It was one of grim resolve. Their eyes met through the camera's lens, a silent, instantaneous communication. The time for secrets was over. The time for choices was now. Kaylin's movements were swift, decisive. There was no hesitation. The man who had served the directorate for 2 decades was gone, burned away by the truth. All that remained was a core of pure, cold rage and a single, overriding objective. He slapped the emergency release panel. The heavy magnetic locks on Elias's cell disengaged with a percussive thud. "Stay behind me," Kaylin commanded, his voice a low growl. He drew his pulse rifle, the familiar weight a cold comfort in his hands. Elias moved out of the cell just as the first black-armored enforcers rounded the corner, their own rifles raised. They were Kaylin's men, his subordinates, his brothers in arms. They paused for a fraction of a second, their featureless helmets tilting in confusion at the sight of their commander, shielding an Omega. Prime Kaylin, the squad leader's voice crackled, distorted by his helmet speaker. "Stand down. That is a direct order from Director Valerius." "I no longer take orders from him," Kaylin said, his voice echoing in the concrete hallway. The firefight was brutal and short. Kaylin moved with the lethal, predictive grace he had been trained to possess, but his purpose was inverted. He was not an aggressor. He was a shield. He didn't shoot to kill. His shots were aimed at joints, at weapons, at the weak points in their armor he himself had taught them to protect. He was dismantling the machine he had helped build piece by piece. The enforcers, trained to fight dissidents and rabble, were unprepared for the sheer efficiency of one of their own turned against them. But there were too many. They were being pushed back, forced down the corridor toward a dead end. And then he appeared. Director Valerius, standing at the far end of the hall, flanked by two of his personal Praetorian guards. He was dressed in immaculate grey, and he held a sleek, silver weapon, a broad-spectrum neutralizer rifle, capable of shutting down a target's nervous system instantly. His face, illuminated by the pulsing red lights, was no longer serene. It was a mask of cold fury. "This is a regrettable, Kalen," Valerius said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "A deeply inefficient outcome. You showed such promise, such purity of purpose, to be undone by a genetic echo." He raised the neutralizer, aiming it squarely at Elias. "But all flawed instruments must eventually be melted down." As Valerius's finger tightened on the trigger, Elias did something unexpected. He stepped out from behind Kalen. He closed his eyes. He took a single, deep breath and then released it. It was not a sound. It was not a scent. It was a wave, a silent, psychic pulse of pure, unadulterated emotion that washed down the corridor. It wasn't an attack. It was a broadcast of overwhelming sorrow, of a lifetime of loneliness, of a desperate, primal plea for peace. It was the raw, unfiltered essence of the Phoenix Project's power. The effect was instantaneous. The charging enforcers faltered, their movements becoming sluggish, confused. Their helmets and their conditioning were no defense against a weapon that targeted the soul. One of them lowered his rifle, his shoulders slumping. Another sank to his knees, a choked sob escaping his helmet's speaker. The Directorate's perfect order dissolved into emotional chaos. Valerius cried out, stumbling back a step, his hand flying to his temple as if to block out the psychic noise. His calm facade shattered, revealing the raw, terrified alpha beneath. "Abomination," he snarled, fighting the influence through sheer force of will. He steadied the neutralizer and fired. Kalen reacted without thinking. He shoved Elias hard, pushing him out of the line of fire. The neutralizer beam, a bolt of shimmering white energy, struck him high in the left shoulder. The pain was searing, electric, a fire that consumed every nerve. His arm went numb, useless. But the pain was also a clarifying agent. It cut through the psychic wave, through the chaos. It grounded him. With his one good arm, he raised his pulse rifle and fired back, not at Valerius. He shot the main power conduit on the ceiling directly above the director. The conduit exploded in a shower of blue and white sparks. The strobing, red emergency lights died. The corridor was plunged into absolute deafening darkness and chaos. Kalen grabbed Elias's wrist, his grip iron despite the fire in his shoulder. Now, they ran. They plunged into the darkness, guided only by Kalen's muscle memory. Behind them, the sounds of shouting, of weeping enforcers, and Valerius's enraged screams faded into the cacophony of a system collapsing in on itself. They were two fugitives, a broken soldier and a living weapon, who escaping the ruins of a fallen ideology. The darkness of Sublevel 9 was their ally. Kalen, his mind a razor-sharp map of schematics and forgotten pathways, led them through the labyrinth. He pulled Elias into a narrow ventilation shaft, the metal cold against his back. The fire in his shoulder was a constant, throbbing agony, and a trail of blood, dark and sticky, coated his arm. They moved through the city's metal guts, the sounds of the battle above growing fainter until they were replaced by the hum of distant machinery and the steady drip, drip, drip of water. The air changed, losing its sterile metallic edge and taking on the foul but real scent of waste and decay. This was the city's underbelly, the truth beneath the lie of its pristine surface. Kalen's knowledge of the black site's architecture extended to its escape routes, contingencies designed for a scenario just like this, though the designers had always imagined the Enforcer Prime escaping from an enemy, not with one. He found a heavy grate, rusted at the hinges, that led into a main storm drain. With his good arm, he strained against the corroded metal. Elias, silent and focused, added his own strength, and with a collective groan of protesting metal, the grate gave way. They slipped into the tunnel, a cylindrical passage slick with algae and grime, and pulled the grate shut behind them. They waded through ankle-deep, foul-smelling water, the only light now the weak beam from Kalen's wrist-mounted illuminator, its glow reflecting off the curved, weeping walls. They were beneath the city now, truly outside the system. They walked for what felt like hours, the silence broken only by their own ragged breathing and the splash of their footsteps. Kalen's strength was failing, the initial shock of his injury giving way to a deep, draining exhaustion. He stumbled, his wounded side scraping against the rough concrete. Elias's hand was suddenly on his arm, steadying him. "This way," he whispered, his voice startlingly close in the dark. He seemed to be navigating by some other sense, by the subtle shifts in airflow or a memory of his own past escapes. He led them down a smaller, tributary tunnel that sloped upwards. The air began to change again, losing its fetid quality, replaced by the clean, cold scent of night and rain. They came to another grate. This one was lighter. They pushed it open and crawled out, collapsing onto soft, wet soil. Rain was falling, a gentle, steady drizzle from a sky the color of a deep bruise. They were outside, truly outside. Beyond the perimeter wall, beyond the atmospheric dome, Kalen looked up, his vision blurring. He could see the faint, ghostly curve of the city's energy shield far behind them. A prison they had finally escaped. The air smelled of things he had only read about: damp earth, wet leaves, distant rot, and the unparalleled purity of the rain itself. It smelled of freedom. Kalen's legs gave out. He slumped against the base of a large, moss-covered rock, his head falling back. The rain washed the grime from his face, mingling with the sweat on his brow. The pain in his shoulder was a white-hot nova. He was losing too much blood. Elias was immediately at his side, kneeling in the mud before him. His face was pale in the dim light, his dark eyes wide with concern. He looked at the tattered, blood-soaked fabric of Kalen's uniform. Without hesitation, he took the hem of his own thin tunic and ripped a long, clean strip from it. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice gentle. He pressed the makeshift bandage firmly against the wound on Kalen's shoulder. Kalen hissed in pain, his whole body tensing. "It's just data," Kalen gritted out, the words an automatic, absurd echo of his former self. It was a joke, dark and bitter, a final goodbye to the man he used to be. A faint smile touched Elias's lips. "No," he said softly. "It's blood." He applied more pressure, his expression focused, serious. His other hand came up to cover Kalen's own, which was clenched into a fist on his leg. The touch was warm, steady. There was no psychic jolt this time, no overwhelming flood of information. There was only the simple, grounding reality of skin on skin, of one living being offering comfort to another. Their faces were inches apart. The rain traced paths down Elias's cheeks, catching in his eyelashes. Kalen could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, but also an incredible, quiet strength. The scent of him, that impossible fragrance of ozone and rain-soaked earth, was all around them, no longer a mystery or a weapon, but a simple fact of their shared reality. It was the scent of the storm they had just weathered, and the scent of the uncertain world that lay before them. Kalen looked into Elias's eyes and saw not an Omega, not a subject, but his only ally in a world that had turned completely upside down. He had been sent to erase him, and instead he had been saved by him. The irony was as sharp and clean as the rain on his tongue. They journeyed for days, moving under the cover of twilight and darkness. Elias seemed to know this broken, untamed world, navigating by the stars Kalen had only ever seen in simulations. He led them high into a remote stretch of mesas, the land growing drier, the air thinner and cleaner. Their shelter was a ruin, but a magnificent one, an abandoned pre-directorate observatory, its great dome fractured like an eggshell, open to the vast, star-dusted sky. It was a place built to look at the universe, a fitting sanctuary for two people who had just been cast out of their tiny, artificial world. Kalen's recovery was slow. The neutralizer wound was not a simple injury. It had damaged the nerves, and his arm was often racked with spasms of pain. Elias tended to it with a surprising, gentle expertise. He found herbs in the arid landscape, bitter-smelling leaves that he crushed into a poultice to draw out the infection, a fibrous root that he steeped in boiled water to ease the pain. He was a survivor, his knowledge born of necessity, of years spent living in the margins. They spoke little in those first days. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with the weight of everything that had happened. It was a space of mutual assessment, of learning the rhythms of a new, shared existence. Kalen would watch Elias as he moved about the observatory, his movements economical and quiet. He would see the way Elias would pause and look to the horizon, his body still tensed for a threat that might appear, the ingrained habit of the hunted. And Elias would watch Kalen as he struggled with the uselessness of his left arm, his frustration a palpable thing, a powerful man suddenly made vulnerable. One night, Kalen stood by the observatory's broken railing, looking out over the moonlit expanse of the desert. The anger was still there, a cold, hard ember in his gut. Anger at his father, at Valerius, at the entire rotten system built on a foundation of lies. But the anger was no longer the all-consuming fire it had once been. It was now overshadowed by something else, something quieter and far more terrifying, a sense of profound, untethered freedom. He had no directives, no protocols, no purpose. The architecture of his identity was gone. He was nothing. Elias came to stand beside him, a silent presence in the vast quiet of the night. He held out a small metal cup. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of the bitter root tea. Kalen took it with his good hand, his fingers brushing against Elias's. The brief contact was warm, real. "What will we do?" Kalen asked, the question addressed to the stars as much as to the man beside him. His voice was raw, stripped of all its former command. It was the voice of a man lost. Elias looked up at the fractured dome, at the river of stars flowing through the opening. "Survive," he answered simply, his voice soft but certain. He turned his head to look at Kaelin, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "And maybe, one day, live." Later, a small contained fire pushed back the desert chill in the center of the observatory's main floor. Elias was asleep, wrapped in the single blanket they had, his form a small, still shape in the flickering firelight. His face, relaxed in sleep, had lost its guarded tension, looking younger, more vulnerable. Kaelin sat watch, his pulse rifle across his lap, habit he couldn't yet break. He watched the flames dance, casting moving shadows on the curved walls. He thought of the man he had been, the alpha who hated omegas, the hunter, the perfect instrument. That man was a ghost, a fiction crafted from grief and lies. He had died in the darkness of Sub-Level 9, his ashes scattered by the force of a devastating truth. The man who sat here now, nursing a wounded shoulder and guarding the sleep of the one he was meant to destroy, was someone else entirely, someone he didn't know. He breathed in. The air was a mixture of dry wood smoke, the clean, cold scent of the high desert night, and something else, the constant, gentle fragrance that was uniquely Elias, ozone and rain-soaked earth. It wasn't a threat or a clue or a weapon anymore. It was just a presence, a comfort, a scent that, impossibly, was beginning to feel like home. He was not a hunter. He was not an enforcer. He was Kaelin. And as he watched the slow, even rise and fall of Elias's chest, he realized that for the first time in his entire hollow life, that might just be enough. The future was a blank, terrifying map, but for the first time, he was not alone in it.